So let's keep that in mind. I'm going to go to the next slide and kind of make a little more sense about how this game came together in 1919 and where it took from then. So this might be a little difficult to see now, but I want to kind of put this event into context, both in baseball history and kind of American history and local history. So the oldest kind of recognized professional baseball franchise in the United States is the team that now exists as the Atlanta Braves. In 1871, they moved from Cincinnati to Boston and took on the name the Boston Red Stockings. And the league they played in eventually became the National League, which is half of Major League Baseball today. And sometimes it's referred to as the senior circuit because it's older than the American League by about 30 years. So that was really big, starting in the 1870s in baseball. So for that 30 years, there was only one show in town, and that was the Boston Nationals or Boston Red Stockings. They changed their name quite a bit because baseball wasn't a very profitable sport at the time because, as I mentioned, there's no TV contracts, there's no radio contracts. It's tough to get people to the ballpark based on when you're allowed to play games. You can't play on Saturdays. One of the things that actually started to make baseball profitable in the early part of the 20th century was when they started selling beer at ballparks. And that's where a lot of the money came from, which put a real dent in the business model when Prohibition came. So kind of looking for new ways to find money there. And the way that Babe Ruth and the Little World Series interact with kind of the financial history of baseball, I think is really interesting. So the next moment that I think is worth noticing is 1887 is when Attleboro and North Attleboro separate. So when these games are being staged where, less than 50 years from when we had the separation of those two cities. 1901 is when the upstart American League started to fight against the National League for dominance. There had been some leagues that had started up and had kind of failed. The American League kind of came in, was run by people who had experience in the National League and Major League Baseball, and really took off. So between that point, so the first World Series is 1903. So 2 years after the American League starts up as this kind of younger upstart league challenging the National League dominance, they play this World Series and the American League wins. The Boston Red Sox win. And it was actually 2 years later, the Boston Red Sox again won the American League title, but the New York Giants actually refused to play them in the World Series. They just kind of thought the World Series was kind of a waste. It was an added extra. The Giants already won the National League. We're not going to even participate in that. Which kind of puts into perspective what happens 16 years later with the Black Sox about how much of this was seen as being an actual competition, how much of it was a business, and why they were being motivated that way. But if you look at quickly, 1903, the Red Sox win the World Series. 1912, the Boston Red Sox win the World Series. 1914, the Miracle Boston Braves win the World Series. 1915 and 1916, the Boston Red Sox win back-to-back World Championships. And in 1918, the Boston Red Sox win the World Series, again in a shortened season that was cut short because of preparations for World War I. So Boston is the mecca of baseball at this time. Two Major League franchises in the previous 10 years had won at least one World Series. The Red Sox were very dominant, in that kind of era. So you can kind of imagine, and baseball being the only sport, how big of a deal in Attleboro baseball would have been. And a lot of people would have been following it probably through the Attleboro Sun's reporting of it in the paper. So to kind of go back, Attleboro history, 1914, Attleboro is incorporated as a city. By April of 1917, Attleboro enters World War II. More than 800 men from Attleboro served in the armed forces during that war. We see the war end November 11th of 1918. Shortly after the Red Sox won the World Series. And then quickly into the next year, we're looking forward to these kind of semi-professional baseball players coming to Attleboro as the major league season is ending. So we're in September to October. The major league season is kind of coming to a close. And in the American League, we have the Chicago White Sox running away with the American pennant. So that brings us to Game 3. So if you know anything about the Black Sox of that year and their owner, Charles Comiskey, he was kind of a miserable SOB. He underpaid his players. They actually, before they threw the World Series that year, they earned the reputation of the Black Sox because he started charging his players to clean their uniforms. So in protest, a lot of the players just decided that they weren't going to have their uniforms clean. So they just played in dirty uniforms, became the Black Sox. So the Chicago White Sox are coming for a weekend series to play the Boston Red Sox at Fenway. North Attleboro is tired of being embarrassed by Attleboro in these baseball games. They had played a number of these kind of semi-professional series in previous years, and Attleboro kept winning. So North Attleboro has a solution. Frank Kelly, they have Kelly Boulevard in North Attleboro is named after him, takes a car, drives up to Fenway, and says, I want a pitcher. You got to come up with a pitcher. Someone like, do you have an extra arm, extra body who can play for my team? And they say, well, no, we don't really have a pitcher for you, but we do have some position players that we're not using today. So the Red Sox said, you can take our backup first baseman, Del Gaynor, and the Chicago White Sox said, you can take our backup third baseman, Fred McMullen, and we're just going to loan them out for the day to come play this exhibition series in Attleboro that no one's really going to care about. For those of you who know baseball history, Fred McMullen is one of the 8 men out who conspired with his teammates to intentionally lose the World Series in the coming weeks to the Cincinnati Reds to get a payout from gamblers. So if you kind of think about, if you're a Major League Baseball player and you show up at Fenway Park, if you think about a player today, shows up at Fenway Park ready for a great series, and then the owner tells you, actually, you're going to go to Attleboro, and you're going to play a game in front of a bunch of yokels with some semi-professional players, and that's how you're going to spend your Saturday. And they probably figured that, and I already paid you for that game, so I'm pocketing any amount of money that the local city or town's giving me. And it's not a whole lot of respect, and you got to think that's played, you know, if that's an indicator of the way that Black Sox players were treated by Charles Comiskey, you know, there might have been an incentive to, you know, throw the series at that point. So North Attleboro came out victorious in that game with the help of their 2 Major League stars. And that just led to a kind of arms race between Attleboro and North Attleboro to scour out the best available talent for these games. So in addition to baseball players, what I kind of want to think about is kind of our historic themes that run through this and connect the Attleboro World Series to the larger history. So I was in college, they had this like idea that I still think is crazy. They wanted us to teach everything as place-based history. So like if you're going to like teach math through like, you know, wetland preservation or something, or like local history through everything, this is like the one example I've found like ever that I can connect to, you know, historical themes to one particular place in time. So it works out well. So Boston, I think it's safe to say, was the center of the baseball universe in 1919. So 6 world championships from 1903 to 1918. You know, that's more dominance than the New England Patriots right now having. So I think that Boston had that claim. Professional baseball is on the brink of a new business model. I won't try to get too bogged down in details, but there had been a challenge to the monopoly that organized baseball in the American and National League had during the middle of the 19-teens with something called the Federal League, which was created by a bunch of very wealthy businessmen, kind of similar to, if you remember football history, the USFL in the 80s, where they had like the Donald Trumps of their era trying to start teams. None of them ran for president afterwards, but they did challenge the system, and they essentially enticed players. Players at the time, there's no free agency. So if you were a farm boy in Iowa and you got signed by the Chicago Cubs, you were the property of that team in perpetuity. The rule was that they couldn't pay you any less than they paid you the year before, but they had no reason they had to pay you any more than they paid you either. It's called the reserve clause. So players really had no negotiating position. Your choice was either to sign the contract that you were given, and maybe, the owner had a soft spot for you, he'd give you a little more money, but you didn't really have much negotiating leverage.